It was time for Colonel H. Jones to do what he thought he did best: lead from the front. He identified an isolated Argentinian position just up there that he thought he could take out on his own. Clutching his submachine gun, he charged up the hill, but immediately withering fire broke out from this hill up there, other Argentinian positions. He was seen to fall over, but he got back up and kept charging. Then he was shot in the back and collapsed, mortally wounded, only meters away from his target. This memorial marks where Jones fell. As their commanding officer lay dying, it now fell to the second in command, Major Chris Keeble, to lead the men. 2 Para were pinned down out in the open, and they were still a mile short of their objective, the airstrip at Goose Green.
This was 2 Para's position. This is where they were pinned down by heavy fire coming from the Argentinians dug in along this ridge. Keeble decided that rather than risk more losses, he'd bring heavy fire down on the Argentinian defenses on the ridge. While this was happening, 2 of his other companies moved around to the west to bring pressure on the Argentinians' flank. Slowly, 2 Para pushed forward as Argentinian fighter bombers hit them from the air. Then their luck turned, and they got their first air support of the fight. 2 Harriers swept over the battle and dropped cluster bombs on the Argentinian artillery positions. After 14 hours of intense fighting, the Para's steady progress saw them closing in on the Argentinians. But they'd taken a lot of casualties, and they were utterly exhausted. That night, Keeble decided on a cunning ploy to try and bluff the Argentinians into an early surrender. He sent a letter to the Argentinian commander. In a highly confident tone, he demanded an Argentinian surrender and warned them that he would bombard them heavily and hold them responsible for any civilian casualties if they went on fighting. Amazingly, the gamble worked. The Argentinians agreed to surrender.
The next day, the Paras were astonished to see over 900 Argentinians, nearly twice their own number and nearly 3 times more than they had expected, lay down their weapons. After 6 weeks under Argentinian occupation, Goose Green was back in British hands, and the soldiers of 2 Para were heroes. But the battle for this tiny place had come at a huge cost.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain James, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman, Corporal Sullivan.
More than 70 soldiers were dead, 16 British and over 50 Argentinians.
Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley.
What had begun as a quick raid to seize back the airstrip and liberate the community had turned into a bloody battle in the struggle for the Falkland Islands.
The British had won the first round of their land campaign against all the odds. But ahead of them still was the battle to regain Stanley. While 2 Para had been fighting at Goose Green, the main British force had crossed the island and was now just 12 miles from the capital. But the soldiers knew they faced a tough fight between them and Stanley.
We've got to take Stanley. No stopping us now, I don't reckon. Got to get it done fast, so the only way to do it is get in there.
Do you have any feelings of apprehension, though?
Oh yes, definitely. Without a shadow of a doubt.
Everything seemed to be going to plan. But then the British campaign suffered a massive blow. What followed was the largest single British loss of life in the war.
Just a few miles away from the troops, two landing ships, Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, were anchored just off this bay. They were packed with nearly 500 troops, reinforcements for the assault on Stanley. These ships should have been offloaded under cover of darkness, but a series of delays and misunderstandings meant they were still here when the sun came up. The Argentinians spotted the ships and called in their air force from the mainland. Two Argentinian fighter bombers swept in on a deadly bombing run. They caught both ships in broad daylight, packed with troops and ammunition. "49 men were killed and a further 115 injured in the disaster.
But this British tragedy was a significant morale boost for the Argentinians. Menendez was told that 900 British had died, and he now expected a slackening in the British momentum. But he was in for a rude shock.
9 days after the landings at San Carlos, a senior commander, Major General Jeremy Moore, took overall control of the British land campaign. Undeterred by the Argentinian air attacks, Moore moved around 9,000 troops into position near the hills surrounding Stanley.
The battle for Stanley was about to begin. Here's Mount Kent, where we are now. Heavy Argentinian forces lay between Moore here and the capital. He would attack in 2 stages on 2 separate nights.
On the first night, his offensive would sweep from north to south, a 3-pronged attack on the Argentinians. Moore planned to take this outer ring of hills, the largest of which was Mount Longdon in the north here. On the second night, the British would assault another ring of hills nearer Stanley, centred here on Mount Tumbledown. Success would leave them just 2 miles from Stanley. The first targets were the Argentinian troops dug in all over Mount Longdon. Mount Longdon is a natural fortress. Over 500 feet at its highest point, it dominates the surrounding moorland. For the British forces, this was a dangerous place to attack. And after their experiences at Goose Green, they didn't want their troops caught advancing in the open terrain in daylight. So they made a key decision. All the battles to retake Stanley would be fought at night.
Night fighting is a highly effective strategy. Every soldier in the British forces has to be as good at fighting in the dark as in daylight. I joined the British Army on a training exercise to experience what it's like. The attack began with flares and machine gun fire once we'd crept as close as we could in the pitch dark. It's incredibly noisy and it's actually quite bewildering. Just moving around in these conditions is very difficult. You're weighed down by your equipment. There's people tripping over, falling in the frozen stream and turning ankles. The enemy is not the only challenge in this dark and difficult terrain. Despite how hard it is to operate in the dark, it's imperative that the attacking troops don't get pinned down. At the moment, the most important thing is we've done our attack. We've got to keep up the momentum, keep up the speed, and I guess keep the enemy off balance. We're about to go over this rise now, and interestingly, the commander here is constantly telling everyone what's going on in the rest of the battlefield. Even though it's only 50 or 100 metres away, it's very confusing in the dark. We can just hear firing and lots of shouting. So he's constantly going around telling everyone what stage we're at, trying to keep everything going to plan. For the British troops on the Falklands, keeping to the plan and maintaining momentum would be the key to their success when fighting at night.